Welcome to the first Math Club podcast of this tenure. Today we have Professor Prahlad Vaidyanathan with us. Prahlad sir has been working at IISERB for how many years?
12 years now.
12 years. It has been a very long time. Sir has done his PhD from Purdue University, and his research interests are C algebra and operator theory.
C-star algebras, yeah.
So just to start, how does it feel to be a mathematician, that too at IISERB?
I don't know how to answer that, but I mean it's fun. You get to do what you like most of the day, and teaching and research are both lots of fun for me. So it's actually quite a privilege to be doing what I'm doing. Yeah.
Makes sense. Where do you think your interests personally lie? Whether it be teaching side of mathematics or the actual grunt work and the research side?
Both. I mean, depends on the day, depends on the semester, depends on what I'm doing. By and large, I treat both as kind of fueling the other. I enjoy teaching, so when I feel like teaching or working on my teaching, I make notes or I go and teach a class. But usually the research helps with the teaching, and the teaching helps with the research. So it's a symbiotic sort of relationship.
So do you spend most of your time whether it be teaching or proper research?
Most of my time is spent doing research.
Okay.
I would say about 70-80% of my time is research, and the remaining 20-30% is.
So how does a day look like for you when you're saying a day is most of your time is spending it in research specifically?
So I mean that's okay. So let me tell you how I structure my day. I usually come in around 9 o'clock, and I do my research side of things till lunch, and then post lunch I have my meetings with my students, and if there's some paperwork, admin work, do that. I usually save my teaching prep for a Saturday or something. I prefer to do it on the weekends. What research looks like kind of depends on what I'm doing at the time. So a project could either be at the beginning stage where you're just kind of learning new material, you're trying to figure out what other people have done. You're just reading papers, so a lot of the time gets spent reading papers and trying to sort of solve problems that people have already solved. And then there's a second stage where you're trying to solve your own problem. You identify something that you want to work on, and you start working on it. You typically get stuck. You work out a few examples. That's the bulk of research work. I'd say about 80% of it is working on examples, specific situations where you're trying to understand a certain phenomenon, you're trying to recognize a certain pattern, and you spend your time working out these examples. And then the last maybe 20% of it is writing it up, where you write up a paper, you either you cut out ideas that are not necessarily relevant to what you want to say, and you try to put it down in a way that would make sense to the audience you're trying to. So you have to put it in a framework of where it sits in the existing theory and what you're trying to say, and so on and so forth. So that would take the remaining 20%, but it's a very small part of the actual process. Most of the process is trying out things, trying out examples, much like the way you would solve homework problems.
Okay.
I mean you should think of it as a version of that.
So generally the idea being you solve many problems, and from that you gain certain insights, and with those insights you try to identify certain problems.
Certain patterns. I mean, you're looking to build a theory or a framework within which you can explain certain phenomena. And your first job is to understand what those phenomena are. So you work out some examples, you see how these things behave, and then you sort of come up with an idea as to what framework they could fit in. You would have seen this, for instance, when you're learning calculus, even where you add up 10 things, you can just add them up, but if you're adding infinitely many things, you need some framework within which to talk about that, and you build a theory after understanding some specific examples. If you're adding ones again and again, then you can't do that. You know that it's going to blow up, so you try to build a theory that makes sense for you, and then you come up with this idea of a series or whatever. And broadly, higher math is no different philosophically than that. It's just the tools change, the themes change.
Makes sense. So coming a bit to your background and how that has complemented your work till now, how do you feel like when you have done like maybe your postdoctoral research or even your PhD? How do you think the tools which you learned at that point of time have helped you now?
Oh, they help all the time. I mean, what you learn doesn't go away, and you keep building on it. Especially the PhD work is foundational. I mean, everything up until that was more general, but during your PhD, you tend to focus on one problem and one set of ideas. In my case, it was operator algebras, and of course, those ideas get used all the time. Actually, current work today and what I was doing during my PhD in again, philosophically is not very different. You know, you've identified a problem, you work on it, you try to solve it. You get better at using the tools that you know. You get a better sense for what problems are interesting for you and what is likely to be solvable. But beyond that, the difference between a PhD and what I'm doing today is not much in terms of the ideas. Yeah.
Makes sense. Do you feel like when we see like most of undergraduate math, you're learning a bit of everything? Do you think like specialization should be something which should be earlier on introduced to a student's career, or should it be something which should be saved later on?
No, I'm not a big fan of specialization early because I think if your goal is to do research or even apply the math that you're learning in industry, it's good to have a variety of tools. And what you learn in the undergrad, especially in the first 3 or 4 years, is pretty much basic for everything else that you'll end up doing. You know, even if you're doing like actuarial science or you're working in Google or wherever, you're going to need a lot of the tools that we teach here, like a combinatorics course or a group theory course or something like that. So specializing before that stage is not a good idea, but certainly by the 5th year, like once you reach the 5th year or the 2nd year of masters, depending on where you're studying, it's good to specialize and sort of find what you like to do, which is why we have the 5th year project here. I mean, it's designed to make sure that you kind of specialize and start working on something that you can hopefully take forward.
So how did you found this particular research interest and how did you enter this field?
It was not really planned. I mean, you kind of learn things that you like, and as you learn more and more things, you sort of start to identify certain themes or ideas that appeal to you. But honestly, even after you pick something, it doesn't have to be the only thing that you do for the rest of your life. So in my case, I happen to like analysis and topology and algebra and pretty much everything. I chose this field because it has a nice mix of all those subjects. So on days when I feel like doing analysis, which is basically calculus grown up, I do that. When I feel like doing algebra, I do that. When I feel like doing topology, I do that. And these are pretty much the 3 main fields within math, at least pure math. And I like all of them, so I get to do all of them, which for me is a good reason to be.
Makes sense. Again, like more on your background, if you think about it, how does a maths student, let's say someone who's just completed their master's or just completed undergraduate, decide to where should they move on? And like, how did you come to the understanding that, oh, maybe I should go to Purdue to pursue higher math?
The choice of Purdue was kind of, you apply to places and you get in wherever you get in. And yeah, there is some thought that goes into it, but it's not as much as, say, choosing math. Honestly, I think you should choose math if you like it. That's my only explanation for doing what I do. Yeah, I enjoy it, and I have always enjoyed it since I don't know when. And as long as you're liking it, you should keep doing it. And there comes a point, I think, somewhere in your 3rd year or 4th year that you figure out that this is what you want to do. You're also at an age where you have learned enough about other things. 20, 21, you've picked up other things, and at that age, you feel like you want to make a commitment if you want to one subject. And math happened to be that for me. But generally, one should go by what one likes. There's a gut feel on this side. Can't quite explain it.
Makes sense. So, considering that, I think you were also heavily active with the admin work here, right?
Yeah, to some extent.
So, like, how were your days back then when you were like really involved in admin work? How did that shape your understanding of the culture here and beyond that, your work?
That's a good question. So, okay, when I started off, within 6 months, I became a warden of a hostel, and there was this council of wardens. The hostels were still coming up. That was a very interesting phase because it's you deal a lot with students and student problems, and very strange, interesting things happen in hostels, which at least in my case, I had forgotten after 10 years of not being in a hostel like that. So it was nice to be part of that culture, and you get a sense for what students are like after a kind of a long break. So I definitely enjoyed that. I also like being a part of a system. Like, I like building systems. In an institution like ours, we're just about 15 years old, which is fairly young for an institution. The systems are not so well defined. For instance, a student wants to apply for leave. There's some paperwork that needs to be done, but when we join, even that, there are so many corner cases. The system is not well equipped to handle all those cases. So it's nice to be a part of that building process. That's one of the reasons I joined here. I like having getting my hands dirty, figuring out what works for people, what makes the system tick. I have to say, after 10 years, I think I've experienced that enough, and while it's fun, it does take away from your research and the teaching and all that. So also now the institution is that much older, so there are many things that are well established in the system. So I kind of now I feel I can step back and just do lesser things just within the department, helping the department grow. The wider institute has already reached a point where I think it can sort of grow by itself. But it's nice to build systems like that. It's nice to be involved in that. So yeah,
makes sense. Noting that you earlier said that you have been here for like 12 years, what are like the major changes you saw throughout the institute?
A lot of growth. I mean, when I joined, I think there were about 40 faculty. Now there's about 160. I think the batch intake, when I joined, the first batch that I taught had about 100 students. Now I think we're taking 400 odd students every year. So seeing that change just in terms of sheer volume of people is quite nice. It was a small institution. The first batch graduated in 2013. I think there were 18 students in that batch. All told, I think there were like 3 in math and maybe 3 in every department. We had much less departments back then. So that's one major change. Like, the size of the place has grown a lot. Also, buildings have come up. The sort of look of the place has changed. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, this place was bone dry when we moved here. There wasn't a single tree on campus. So it's nice to see the campus looking nice now. And also you sort of build relationships over time with people around you. So it's nice that a lot of the people who were there 12 years ago, most of them are still here, and we're still trying to figure out the way the place grows. So you build relationships that are quite long lasting. That's always good. What has changed? Beyond this, I mean, many things and not much at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, there's some things that remain the same over a long period of time, even though the volume changes.
But focusing on like maybe the student culture, you said as there were like previously only 18 students, and now we have reached a gross strength of like 400. How was it when it was like, oh, you're only catering to 3-4 students, and now like at minimum you're catering to like 30-40 students each?
Logistically, things change. I have to say, the class I taught last semester had about 300 students. I think I know about 30 people by name. I can't possibly learn more than that in a semester. So that changes. When you teach small classes, you have a personal interaction with students, which disappears in bigger classes. and also just managing email and paperwork for these big classes is a bit taxing. So personally, I like the smaller classes. 30, 40 is a nice number to teach. That being said, we're a public institution. We have a certain obligation. We have to take in more students. So it's nice to also serve that role in society, because I think we need good educational institutions in the country, and I think this is one of them. But there are times where I wish we had smaller numbers in a class. So maybe there's a future in which there'll be more faculty. We'll be able to split up the bigger classes into smaller batches. I don't know, but it's fine. I mean, last semester was good fun. I had a good time teaching 300 people. But it is a bit overwhelming when you walk into class and there's 300 people sitting there.
Coming forward, like if we even look at your background earlier, could you tell more about your undergraduate days and comparing your undergraduate year maybe with the undergrads here? How was that different?
Oh, vastly different. Where I did my undergrad was in Chennai. I have to say that in my class I had about 80, maybe 75 people in my class, and only 3 of us ended up doing a master's after that. Most people end a job after that. Whereas here, I think the culture is there's more intellectual growth that happens, and more emphasis on that. There's a culture of wanting to learn and learning more as a result of it. That was not so much there where I did my undergrad. It was more about getting a job, and most people came from modest backgrounds, so they needed the jobs also. I was one of the lucky ones who could afford the luxury of doing a master's and doing a PhD. Most people can't. So it was very different. But at the same time, I'm glad I had that experience. That teaches you a lot about maybe the world outside math and outside academia. It's a good learning experience. But here it's very different. I think here you have all these clubs, you have all the extra academic activity that tends to happen even outside the classroom. We never had much of that. We just had games and classes.
So are there any fun maybe incidents which you had with your students here, or maybe some notable memorable students which you like to share?
Nothing for public consumption, perhaps. I mean, there were a lot of minor incidents in the hostels and stuff. Nothing I can pinpoint. We've had a lot of good students, I have to say. I mean, over the years, I've taught some wonderful students, both PhD and BSMS, many of whom either did a project with me or I got to know them outside the classroom, and some still keep in touch. So those are obviously memorable people. I couldn't point to any one incident, but there are a lot of people who've come through who I think are very good people outside of the math and outside of everything else. They're just good people.
Makes sense. I mean, do you feel like generally when people, or when we talk about mathematics in general, do you think people when they sort of join mathematics, it becomes very intimate, whereas in the prof and student relation is quite closer and quite strong when it comes to mathematics in specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have smaller groups for one thing. There's no large labs. We don't have 10 students. Most of us have 1 or 2 students. Even in the masters, nobody takes more than 2 or 3 students at a time, rarely. So the groups tend to be small. The interaction almost always is one-on-one or one-on-2 at most. So you get to know the person much better. You understand them certainly mathematically, but somehow that leads to a relationship where you know the other person, outside of math also. And also it's once you're a little older as a student, the age gap between the professor and the student also shortens. So you tend to have maybe, I wouldn't say more in common, you just have a more similar wavelength. So you talk, at least the math talk becomes more
it becomes more seamless in that way.
Exactly. You learn from each other. I think that's the big thing for me and this, both the BSMS project and the PhDs. You get to learn from the student. which is probably the first time the information goes the other way. Actually changed from before.
Do you feel where IISERB as an institute, do you feel like that transfer where students are helping these faculty members to maybe understand their field in like maybe much more depth or just general breadth? Do you feel IISERB or the culture which has been built here has been unique in that way?
I wouldn't say it's unique, but it's certainly rare. There are not many places, both here and abroad, where the interaction between students and faculty is, without any real barriers, especially at the PhD level and even to an extent at the BSMS level. People, for the most part, students are welcome to walk into an office and ask the professor whatever they want. Some places tend to be a little more rigid about that distinction. I think here many of us are happy to blur those lines, and it's nice because I think that creates an environment where this kind of learning happens. You learn from the student as much as they learn from you, and also I think it makes it so that there's less to worry about. There's this sort of easier environment to work in.
Means that makes sense.
But it's not unique, I wouldn't say. I mean, I dare say many institutions are like this, but they are rare, definitely.
Makes sense. What do you think then is something special about maybe IISERB Bhopal or like the people here in general which you feel makes it different in different ways?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. See, the IISERs are hard to distinguish from each other because they tend to have a sort of homogeneous environment. At least Bhopal, Mohali, Pune, these places tend to have a fairly wide variety of students from all over the country. I can't say there's any one thing that I can point to over here. Being in Bhopal, Bhopal as a city has certain advantages. It's a green city, it's not as crowded or polluted. But IISER specifically, I can't think of any one thing that would I can't pinpoint to any one thing and say this is true only for IISER Bhopal and not for the other IISERs. That's what I mean.
Well, then extending the question maybe, what do you think maybe like since IISERs are known for like the interdisciplinary science, how does that experience maybe the maths department here? How do that interplay?
Okay, so by and large, when projects are interdisciplinary, either at the BSMS or the PhD level, there tends to be a lot of very fruitful interaction between the faculty members of the departments also. And over time that grows into maybe offering courses together, doing common projects together. That's already happening and has been happening for a few years now. The fact that the emphasis is on that and it's clear from day one that that's what is expected is nice, because it makes sure that nobody sits in their office and only does what they've been doing their whole life. You tend to interact, you tend to force yourself to be in situations where you can learn from other people. So that's good. I don't know how else to answer that question. I think that's basically what I have to say.
Makes sense. So recently I think you published a book, right?
Yeah.
So how was that experience? How did maybe you could outline the process for us?
Okay, so the process in short is it took me about a year to write the book and then a year to get it published, in the sense that so the writing is self-explanatory. You just write and you formulate the book the way you imagine it. Then it has to go to referees and come back, and then it has to go through this process of typesetting and editing and so on and so forth. That took a whole year. I have to say the first part was good. It was great. To be honest, it was also, I wrote it partly to escape from COVID. So COVID was in full swing back then, and it was extremely depressing. So it was nice to have something to do that is, more work in a sense. I was teaching, I was doing research, but this gave me something else to do and put my energy into, which is something I needed personally at the time to throw myself into a project that was so I didn't have to read the news. I tried very hard not to read the news for almost a year. So that was perhaps one big reason to do that at that time. I mean, I would have done it anyway at some point in life, but the reason I chose to do it then was that I needed a break from COVID, and it ended up being a very interesting process. The writing process clarified certain thoughts for me. I had already taught the course a few times, so I knew what I wanted to put in the book, but exactly how to do it, what problems to put. There are things you say in a classroom that you can't really say in a book. You can't crack a joke the same way you do in a classroom. So you had to find ways to lighten the book without cracking a silly joke. So that was an interesting process, trying to see the book from the point of view of somebody learning from it instead of just writing for my sake. So it was a very, very interesting process. The second half of it, the whole editing and typesetting and all, was a bit boring, to be honest. There was a lot of stuff in there where you would just send documents and then wait for it to come back, and then you would proofread it and send it back. It was not terribly exciting. It just was something you had to do, and after a while it got boring. But it's a necessary part of the process. I mean, once you write it, you need to see the project through, so you have to put in the effort to do that. So I guess at the end of the day, it was worth it. It's nice to sort of see the book and also to have other people read it and give you feedback on it. That part is nice. That period in the middle where there's all this typesetting and this boring stuff going on is what it is. You just have to.
A bit more about the book. How does one make a math textbook, basically? Because if one thinks about it, writing a novel is completely different, where someone is like writing from the heart. How does one think of it? You know what? I want to write a maths textbook now.
Well, obviously, I think it helps to have taught a little bit before that. It helps to have had the experience of explaining an idea to another person. And the book is essentially a larger version of that. There's a lot of ideas which you want to explain a certain way. There are, at this point in life, I have read many, many textbooks. So you have a sense for what people write, like how people write a textbook. You know what to look for. Specifically, you know what you like and what you don't like about certain books. So you try to sort of access the things that you like, and you write the book that you would want to read, basically. How you go about doing that is a little bit of experience, I guess. I mean, once you've taught a few times, you at least know the content. You know what you want to say. How you say it, then you have to tailor it to the audience. But knowing what to say is, I guess, half the battle. And having taught a little bit helps. So.
Talking a bit more about like teaching experience, how do you feel like when we teach in terms of maybe master students or PhD students? How does that differ from like incoming BS students who are like very excited?
Vastly different. For one thing, the class strength is much bigger in the lower levels. But even not accounting for that, the way you teach like a Calc 1 versus the way you teach a PhD course are totally different. Because in Calc 1, your goal there is to ensure, in a sense, that everybody gets something from the course, regardless of their interests. Because the first year students, nobody's chosen a major, so it's not clear whether they're doing the math course because they want to do math or because they absolutely don't want to do math and they're trying very hard to get away from it. And you have to cater to all those audiences, and so you have to have something for everybody. You also have to make sure that the people who are not really inclined towards math still do enough in the course that they can say that I have learned calculus or I have learned probability or whatever. Whereas at the higher levels, everyone's self-motivated for the most part. Everyone's there only because they want to do it. So your job is very different. Your job is to make sure that you point them in the right direction. Like you don't necessarily have to give them full details of a proof or anything like that. You can just give them a rough idea and then ask them to read it, because they will. I mean, that's because they're motivated to do that. You don't necessarily have to go through the details of every example. You can just give them the idea. Your job there is to more give ideas, like explain to them why certain things work. For instance, a proof is typically a very rigorous thing. You start with a hypothesis, you have to write down step by step. So that's the actual proof. But the idea behind it might be very different. It might very well go backwards. So your job at the higher levels is to teach that, is to teach the idea and then let them work out the details, because they usually will. Sometimes you have to work out the details also, of course, but a lot of the time your job is to get the idea across. Whereas at the lower levels, your job is to make sure that they have good notes to look at before the exam. So you have to give them complete notes. You can't just skip steps. That's not a good thing. Because people are not everybody is inclined towards math and can fill in those gaps. So you have to make sure that whatever you give them is as complete as possible.
Do you feel like the intuition which you gain from like mathematics in particular at lower levels help you in like other disciplines, whether that be rigor, whether that be proof writing? How would
Absolutely. I mean, if nothing else, the logical thinking helps. Math is distilled version of logic, so it helps to have that, because in any problem that you're working on or any walk of life, it helps to know, to write down, specifically, this is what I have, this is what I need to do, how do I go from step A to step B, without getting confused. And specifically this happens, for instance, if you're managing your finances, or you are, buying a car. You need certain skills to list down all the data you have and interpret that data. And math gives you that ability without cluttering your head with unnecessary baggage. It keeps it simple for you. And that certainly helps in many situations outside of even academia.
With contrast to that, if we think about maths at higher level, people tend to say like, oh, mathematicians are like sitting in their offices or like their caves, basically doing math all day. Whereas in reality, maths is very collaborative. How would you like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fun, and this is why I like teaching, is to talk about what you're doing. I mean, it's obviously not enjoyable in any situation to just sit by yourself and do something. It's nice to talk to people and nice to exchange ideas. It's particularly relevant here because when you're explaining an idea to somebody else, often you spot mistakes in your own thinking while you're explaining. That's, I think, the big reason why people like to collaborate, is because when you're talking to somebody else and sometimes you overlook mistakes. I mean, this will happen even when you're studying. You may not fully understand an idea, but you might think you understand it until something changes within the system, and then you realize, I didn't understand that at all. That happens a lot, surprisingly, at every level, particularly at the higher levels. You get lulled into a certain complacency as you work through a certain problem. If you spend a long time thinking about something, you think you know it, but that's not always the case. Explaining it really helps in that situation. So, yes, I mean, even when you're talking to a student, oftentimes in a matter of 1 hour, you'll find that there was something that you didn't understand very well, and you have to spend some time thinking about it.
So, like, how does your generally outlook change from these collaborative processes? On one aspect, you're able to identify mistakes, but then how does it feel when you're correcting someone? Because
it's the same. I mean, if you're in a genuinely good collaboration where there are no egos involved or whatever, everyone's fine with pointing out mistakes. In fact, that's what you want. What you want is to understand something. That's what you're looking for. If you make a mistake or the other person makes a mistake, it doesn't matter. That's not relevant at all. So there's not much difference between learning that you've made a mistake or pointing out another person's mistake. The end result is the same, which is that both of you have learned something.
Do you feel like when it comes to mathematics, people tend to keep their egos aside? That is to say that since both of you all have like a common goal of like achieving better understanding of the material at hand, people tend to be much more collaborative in nature.
I'd like to think that all learning should happen like that. But okay, this is my limited experience and somewhat biased experience, is that math is extremely humbling as a subject, because as you learn more, you realize there's so much you don't know. That's true for all things, but particularly so here, because every time you solve a question, there are like 10 more questions that show up. So that naturally ensures that your ego is well within check. There is no chance of your ego really getting the better of you.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I don't know of too many mathematicians who would brag about what they've done, because you know that what you're bragging about, there are like 10 things in there that you don't know. So
Makes sense. If you talk about like your younger days, like for me personally, when I was younger, Euclidean geometry and just simple lines motivated me a lot to like pursue maths further. For you, what was this elementary sort of maths which gave you those aha moments?
I have to say there wasn't much. I joke about this a lot, which is that in school, we were doing whatever polynomial algebra and quadratic equations and all that. That never held much joy for me. I was good at it for whatever reason, but I was not really that into it. In the 11th standard, I had a very good teacher teach me calculus, 11th and 12th, and that really helped me a lot. But I have to say, it didn't happen till I think it was second year of college where I came across some group theory. That changed the way I thought about math, because that was the first time, at least in my limited experience, I was doing something that was not solving problems. Pretty much everything until then emphasized this idea of solving something. You were either figuring out an integral or a quadratic equation or what have you. That was always the main focus until that point. Whereas when I encountered group theory and other things after that, it changed completely, because that's not your goal. Your goal is not to solve an equation or whatever. Your goal is to understand a structure, or to understand an example by breaking it apart and playing with it. And that is when that really changed it for me. Group theory, second year undergrad, if I had to.
If you had to pinpoint it there specifically. Beyond that, we do see a general trend that is, till 11th, 12th, we see math to be much more calculative in nature. Whereas once you come to undergrad, you're like bursted out with like proofs. How do you feel that transition was for you, specifically, but how do you see that maybe in the students here?
Somehow it seems to be the opposite. In my case, when I encountered proofs, it was this feeling of liberation. Like it finally made sense to me why we were doing all the calculations. The calculations always felt a little forced. There didn't seem to be any overarching theme, or even if there was, it seemed a very weak reason to be solving those things. But when you start learning proofs, you understand why those equations or whatever were relevant at all. That being said, I don't know how to do school math and make this transition better. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about. Many of us do, because there is a significant difference between higher math and math in school. I think the transition has to happen in a classroom, in an environment where you're willing to sort of expand your mind. And I'd like to think that many of us do that in the first year and second year, is slowly introduce the idea of a proof. Because once you understand what the idea of a proof is, what it's trying to convey, it's much easier to accept that it is hard or what have you. It's a way of thinking, really. And it's not very different from writing a program or something like that, which somehow we accept as a reasonable thing to do, whereas writing a proof is unreasonable. But really, they're the same thing.
Do you feel like when you talk about like maybe competition math, where it's like the IMOs or like RMOs and stuff like that, do you feel like the transition that is a good entry point for students to get into the rigorous side of math, or do you feel like it's just more calculative in nature?
That depends. I mean, IMO, some problems are they help you learn math. Some tend to be a little more calculative. I have not had much experience with the IMO, so I can't really say for sure. I do know that most people who are good at math early and have that competitive edge tend to take on IMOs or regional Olympiads and all that. I was never that competitive, so I don't have that urge. I think that IMO and that approach to math is meant for certain people. I don't think it's necessarily meant for everyone. You can be a perfectly good mathematician without ever having done an IMO. But yes, if that's what you're interested in, then certainly that's one way to do it. But it's not the only way to do it, is what I'm trying to say.
Makes sense. Means there have been many mathematicians who may not have come from a competitive background, but have still done pretty well throughout the.
Not just pretty well, very well.
Very
It's a certain bent of mind, and also IMO is necessarily meant for younger people. There are certain people who don't encounter real math till a little bit later, and that window then has passed, so you can't really go back and do the IMO. It helps to start when you're in the 6th or 7th standard for the IMO, whereas there are people who are doing other things when they're in the 6th and 7th standard, and they really like things in the 11th standard.
Makes sense. Coming a bit more so we talk about undergraduate and we talk about now coming to sort of how does one think of pursuing their masters? Because doing a PhD is something which you're oh yes, I want to do research in this. Your undergraduate is a general understanding. How does a master's in mathematics fit into this equation?
So to be honest, in today's day and age, an undergrad degree in anything is probably not good enough. Because a lot of industry and academia have gotten very specialized. So just doing 3 years of an undergrad doesn't equip you well enough to apply what you have learned. That's my personal take on it. That being said, like I told you, most of my classmates from undergrad didn't do a master's, so it's a perfectly fine way to go. But I think doing a master's, you should treat it as an extension of the undergrad, and if you are so inclined, it will tell you whether you want to do a PhD or not. It acts as a nice transition period where if you're not sure that you want to do a PhD, but you still like the subject, you still want to learn more, do the master's. In fact, in America, they have most places, and even here we have this IPHD system. In America, most people join a PhD after 4 years of an undergrad. So they start the PhD, and then 2 years later, they have the option to exit with a master's. And that's a perfectly fine option. Many people I know have taken that, and I think that's a fine way to look at it. You don't look at it as a loss. You just look at it as, oh, I didn't want to do a PhD, so I went to a master's.
Makes sense. So this idea of transitioning from maybe a undergraduate understanding of mathematics or any subject for the matter to a PhD, how was that transition for you? Once you got into your master's, were you I want to do a PhD in this immediately, or do you want to?
I think by the time I hit my master's or somewhere around there, I was pretty clear this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to teach and I wanted to do research. Those were the two things that I didn't know a thing about research, but I did want to do it. There was this feeling that this is what I should be doing with my life.
Makes sense. So currently, I think you're taking real analysis for third-year students here at IISERB. How has that experience been so far, at least?
So far, so good. I like it. It's a larger class than I anticipated. There's 170 odd students there. We tend to have lesser numbers, mid-40s in those batches, and now it's grown. It's nice, yet to be seen. It's just been a few weeks now, so but it's been good so far.
As the semester has just started. So how were your experiences when you taught this topic earlier? And
I have never taught this course specifically, but I've taught third year courses a lot. I like that third year phase because for one thing, many of the courses tend to have math students and some students from other departments, econ, physics, etc. So it's a nice mix of people with different interests and different backgrounds. And also the courses are such that they are very foundational for math, the analysis, the algebra and all that. So when you're teaching it, you get to kind of occasionally give interesting windows into what happens next. Because it's the first of a sequence of many courses and many ideas. So you get a chance to do that, which is always fun because it's like a teaser trailer for what's going to come next, and it's nice to do that.
So, aside from your time which you spend mostly like doing math, how do you spend most of your time aside from like mathematics?
Well, I have a young son and wife, so a lot of time gets spent doing household stuff, cooking and cleaning. I read, I listen to music, various things.
So, like, which music platform do you prefer? Like, do you listen to stuff on Spotify, radio, or like Apple Music?
Lately, it's been mostly on Spotify, also on YouTube. So what ends up happening is I discover a band on YouTube because I was listening to something and it showed up, and then I go on Spotify and try to find more stuff about them and listen.
So, like, do you generally tend to listen to music like as in albums or like whatever snippets or songs you like?
Generally, I prefer albums, but usually I sample my way through songs before I pick up a whole album. An album is a commitment, right? It's a 1 hour commitment. You have to listen to the whole thing. So yeah, I listen to songs on and off, and then if I like something, then I pick up the whole album.
So like, who are like the notable artists you have like throughout like your maybe music listening journey, you could say?
It's very hard to answer. So broadly, I listen to Western music, pop and rock, and I have never really had a favorite band or anything. I listen to a lot of different stuff. Since that question was on your list, I looked up what I had listened to over the last 3 days, and I thought I'd tell you I listened to Fleetwood Mac, Cranberries, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Blondie, and U2 over the last 3 days. So, I mean, these are the bands. I don't know how you want to categorize this. They all happen to be rock bands, I guess.
60s to 80s.
60s to 80s rock bands. Yeah. So that's my current jam for the last 3 days. But that does in no way captures what else I listen to. I listen to anything and everything. I have no restrictions. In fact, I like listening to a lot of new music. I like picking up new bands, or if somebody gives me a recommendation, I like to listen to that because I always end up liking something.
So like, are there any like new bands you've been into, or like any?
Let's see. There is this fantastic guitarist by the name of Undu Mokhtar, whom I really like. He's Nigerian. There is another band of African women called Les Amazones d'Afrique. There's an album called Musso Dance, which came out maybe 2-3 months back, which I really like. What else? There's a band called The Arcs, which made an album last year, which was very nice. There's a lady called, I forget her actual name, she has a band, she's a single person band called Cadence, which I really like. I'd have to think. I mean, there's a lot.
Typically, at the end of the year, Spotify gives you like top artists.
Yeah.
So are these the top artists you typically have, or like?
So
do you remember?
So Spotify is very bad at this, at least for me, because I listen to all kinds of things, and there's no like one genre or whatever that picks up for me. So usually at the end of the year, it'll give me something that is partially what I like, but not everything, and not even close to a list. So I've stopped making lists of best albums of the year. I don't do that anymore. I just listen, and then I write it down somewhere and I keep track of it.
It makes sense. I mean, do you like listen to music while like maybe studying or working, or like where do you find the time to listen to music?
Usually mornings. So my mornings I cook and just sort of do stuff around the house. So that's when I listen to music from about 7 to 8 in the morning. And sometimes on the weekends, of course, as much as I can, whenever I'm at home, listen to music playing. I don't listen to it when I'm working because it's distracting. Especially if there are lyrics involved, I find it very difficult to focus. So yeah, it's usually on my free time when I'm doing something else that does not involve so much concentrating.
Makes sense. Coming like to your other hobbies, you mentioned a lot about like the interest in cricket. Could you talk about like how did that interest in cricket started for you?
I mean, it's ubiquitous in India, right? I mean, I think everyone grows up playing cricket at some level. Yeah, so it's exactly that. I don't think I'm any different from most other people. Is that I liked it as a kid. I played it as a kid, and then as an adult, you tend to follow it because it's everywhere, and it's a common ground across many different people. You meet new person, and often cricket is a common thing to talk about. So it's a social glue, if you like, and it's remained that. It's of course it's more than that now. Is you yeah, after what 35 years of listening or watching cricket, you have certain things that you like, and you enjoy talking about it, and you share that with your friends and all that stuff. That's all it is. To call it any more than that is unreasonable.
So like when you were back in the States, did you have to like explain people how cricket was?
Yes and no. I just told them it was like baseball, but not, and they were okay with that. See, luckily I was in an environment where there were many different people from many different backgrounds, so everyone had something to share that was totally out of the blue for everybody else. So it was a melting pot, and there were also enough Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis there that we played cricket. So with them you didn't have to explain anything, with others you had to. But others had to explain something to you, so that was fine.
Makes sense. Do you feel like that is a certain advantage of like doing your PhDs outside of like your host nation, like your home nation, where you're
Yeah.
able to get exposure from like different cultures and stuff?
Right. Of course, I very strongly believe that everyone should live abroad for some amount of time in their lives, if they can, of course. I was lucky enough to do that. It really broadens your horizons a great deal. You meet people from very different cultures, from very different backgrounds, and especially if you're doing a PhD, everyone has a common ground, which is that you like math or whatever as a subject. So you don't lack for things to talk about. At the end of the day, you can always fall back on math, but you learn a lot from people because it's incredible how diverse people can be, even at the same age and same interests. It's really remarkable how different people can be from different countries, and I think it's worth having that experience.
So like coming back to a bit to mathematics again, and also this aspect of culture, does mathematics really like whether it be like notation wise, is it different in other countries, or like just the general understanding of it is
Nowadays, it's become homogenized because of the internet and various other things, and pretty much because of publications. Once a notation gets fixed in one place, it tends to spread. Everyone starts using that. That being said, there are some notation which are still not fixed and tend to evolve over time. But once a theory is relatively mature, as they call it, like once it's been around for a little while, notation also ends up getting fixed. That doesn't mean it's good, it's just fixed.
The motivation behind that question was that is somewhere I heard that natural numbers in like European countries have like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas in other countries have 1, 2, 3, 4.
I don't think anyone's ever agreed on what that is supposed to be. Generally, in India at least, or in Europe, you say whole numbers if you include 0, and you say natural numbers if you don't include 0. I don't think that's a serious enough debate to warrant any attention.
Yeah, makes sense. So coming to like maybe as like we're wrapping up, are there some things which you would like to just say to like the general student body to like maybe motivate them towards math or like whatever they like?
Nothing specific. I would say, like I said at the beginning, keep track of what you're interested in. And it doesn't have to be one thing, it can be multiple things also. It's good to have multiple interests, it's good to pursue them, and eventually you have to find a career. So that's, of course, you have to find the one thing that you want to do, but as long as possible, keeping those doors open is a good thing. And even in the third year, in fact, I generally tell people to look for minors or take courses in other departments while they're pursuing a major. Even if it's not a minor, just keep taking courses. I took courses all the way through my PhD, and I strongly recommend people do that because it's really fun to keep learning outside of your core area of interest. So yeah, that's perhaps, I mean, it's the one thing that occurred to me just now. If I think of anything else, I'll tell you.
So keep on expanding your horizons.
Yeah, I mean, just keep learning. And as you learn, you'll find the thing that you really want to do for the rest of your life. But that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is to just keep learning and enjoying.
Makes sense. And I think with this we can call it a wrap, it seems. So I would like to thank Prahlad sir for giving us his time. And I would like to thank the listeners for taking out their time and to listen to us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
It was great.